Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Another Ask the Stud, number 11. And we're past 100 questions now over the series so far, and it's been real interesting, at least for me, and I hope it's been interesting for everybody out there watching. This one is going on number 11, and it's got some great questions as always, and just keep being amazed at the fans I've got and how knowledgeable they are. And so I'm looking forward to this one as always. And I guess let's just rip right into it.
Our first question is from John Hanley. Hi, Stud. Before you bought the Knoxville promotion, did you know what a monster heel and heat magnet Ron Wright was?
John, that's a good question, and I got to be honest with you, I really didn't know. I had only seen Ron Wright one time, and I had come out of the Florida territory where I was at for 4 years, and he made a little run through there and stayed about 2 weeks one time, and I can't remember, it was probably about 1972 or 73. And it was the first time any of us in that territory, I believe, had a look at Ron Wright. And wow, what an impression he made in that very first day. In fact, he came in, he sat down, and first thing he did was pull his chisel out of his bag, and he started with his little file, and he started filing that chisel down. And it didn't take long for us to be looking at that, and then finally somebody said, "What is that?" And he says, "That's my chisel." And, and they go, "Well, what do you do with that?" And he goes, "Oh, I just put it on the old hand here, and then I smack somebody with it, get some good juice." And, so everybody in the room went, "My God, what's wrong with this guy, right?" And he just sat over there, and every night he did his chisel. He filed his chisel every night, and then he said, "I'm going to be here 2 weeks." And he goes, he says, "I'm going to let y'all see how it works. One time at least, I'm going to let." And, and everybody's like, "Well, you just use it when you want to." And yeah, pretty much. I hit everybody with it, so, so he said. So last night he got his shot, and he got one of the boys and wrapped him in the ropes, and he popped him with the chisel. And then he left the territory. And I never thought I'd see Ron Wright again, right? He went back up into Tennessee, and I was like, wow, man, there must be some crazy guys up there. And then a couple years later, I make a trip, and I buy the Knoxville territory, and lo and behold, the big star is Ron Wright. And I was like, wow, man. And just like the old days, man, the first time I met him, I sat down the very first night when I was in the territory. It was still John Kazana's town. And I was, so I had to, ask John, how does things work? And I was trying to get a feel for everything. And Ron came over and he says, "I remember you, and I said, "Yeah, I remember you too, man." And he says, "I still got me chisel." And me and Ron worked the program. I mean, Ron had always been a heel, and a darn good one, evidently. I don't think he'd ever been a babyface until I got there. And I looked around the territory, and a couple of weeks in, I said, "Ron, I need to turn you babyface. I got to have somebody big to work with, and somebody that can get this done, the talking, the whole deal." I mean, I was very disappointed in a way with the talent that was there and available to me, right? So I was like, "I'm going to have to turn you babyface." And he said, "Ron, I don't know about being no babyface. I've never been a babyface." And I said, "I think you can do anything, Ron." Right? Well, he kind of buckled that boy. "Oh, yeah, you might be right, Ron, And so we had all kinds of matches. And, Ron had tremendous heat, but once he turned babyface, he was so over, man. man. I mean, people just loved him. And because I was from Florida and I was the big guy and I was saying I'm the Tennessee stud and, and all this, I had some really good heat. And that just made Ron get over better and better. So Ron wanted to use the chisel. From the very first time we wrestled, I gotta hit you, Ron. I said, no, Ron, we ain't gonna do that yet, So we had we probably had 5 or 6 matches in which Ron pulled the chisel out in the middle of the match. I didn't even know he had it, right? And he come on, Ron, this is the time. I said, no. And I would smack him, and somehow I'd get the chisel away from him, and I'd hit him with his chisel. And he kept getting bloody, and boy, he was like, God, after a while, he got a little upset, and he said, this ain't right, Ron, you gotta let me do this sometime, do you, down the road here. So I remember the first night that I said that, okay, Ron, this is your night. I told him the day before. I saw him in the town we were running, and I said, tomorrow night's your night. Bring your chisel. Oh boy, he was all he went and got it down. He filed her on down, man. Ron, don't worry about it. All that. So I remember I told my wife. And this was in the Coliseum, the Coliseum show, one of the first Coliseum shows. And I told my wife, I said, we're going to be getting home a little late tonight. I had 2 little boys, right? I had a babysitter. And I said, we're going to get home a little late tonight. And she says, well, why is that? And I said, well, Ron Wright's going to get his night. He's going to hit me with the chisel tonight. And I said, we're going to the hospital. She said, well, how do you know that? And I said, we're going to the hospital. I know that, right? I know it for a fact. Might as well tell the babysitter, better hang in there an hour longer, because I'm going to be getting sewed up. And and so we were around. She sat on the first row. My gimmick was that she was my valet, and she would go down, and I would put her in a seat on the first row. And she sat there, and she knew that he was going to pop me. And when he finally did, and I think he had me in a headlock, and I was on my knees, and I was just right there, perfect for him. Pow! He let me have it. And I remember looking at her before he hit me, and as soon as he hit me, I spun around and looked right at her, right? And the blood was down. It was all over my chest within 2 seconds. It was like, pow. I mean, he got me good, right? And so we went to the hospital that night. And so John, I had no idea how good a heel he was. And nobody in the territory or nobody in that part of the country knew what kind of baby face he could be. So, he not only had tremendous heat, but he had the best talk. I mean, that son of a gun could rap. He could get it done. And, turned out to be my favorite, maybe my favorite guy in all that Knoxville, all that time to work with and to deal with. I mean, he'd do anything you wanted him to do. And, he was just good at everything. He was phenomenal at whatever you wanted him to do. He was just right there and could do it. Later on, going to have the war. He's going to go that direction. But then we're going to come back, and I'm going to come back with Continental, and I'm going to bring him back into the company. I'm going to bring him back into the company with USA. So, I mean, he was with all 3 of the wrestling companies that I ever owned. He worked for me. And, he was an unbelievable talent. And I bet every wrestler in the country that ever knew Ron Wright has just as many Ron Wright stories as I do.
Our next question is from Elwood Sandridge, Weewahitchka, Florida. Ron, when you bought Pensacola, you had 4 partners, Robert, Jimmy, Roy Lee, and Bob Armstrong. And you had a controlling interest. So my question is, how many times did you have to overrule the other 4 guys to make an important decision?
Elwood, that's a good question. I never had any partners with my companies up until that point, and and I wanted to have my family involved. I thought that they deserved it, and we I'd had such great success in Knoxville. Went down there to Pensacola, and felt like I knew that we were going to do good, really good down there. Maybe even better than Knoxville because they had bigger cities, and and it was a really good territory. Traditionally, it had been a really great territory. So I brought my two cousins in, and my brother in, and Bob Armstrong was just like a brother. I mean, I felt like he was my brother too. So and then usually sometimes you get in a situation. I had partners in hockey. I also had partners in my ADT business in Florida, and starting in 2002. But I never had a partner. I had a problem with my partners, Elwood. And certainly these four guys, because they were so happy to be involved in the business, and not just being a wrestler, but in the promotion part of it, and in the money part of it. And to be quite honest with you, the promoters made a lot more money than the wrestlers did. And so they knew that this was going to be something really, really good for them. So we never had it. I don't ever remember having a crossword with any of the four of them. And it wasn't just me that was coming up with ideas. I mean, Rob was a booker, and Bob became a booker while we were there. And everybody had ideas. And so we'd sit down, about once a month. We would have a dividend day in which we would sit down and see how we had done for the month, and then we would have conversations about what are we going to do from here, and who's got an idea about this, whatever. Had a great relationship. Never had better partners than those guys were, and I don't ever remember Elwood having not a single time anybody say anything. If I had an idea, they were all for it. And most of the time, to be quite honest with you, I mean, Bob Armstrong had tremendous ideas, and Rob was a very creative guy. And so, they had all kinds of ideas. And 99% of the time, I was like, wow, I'm on board. That's a good one. So it's a great relationship, and it's a great question, Elwood, down there in Weewa-Hitchcock, man. I know you're a big fan, and I see your name a lot, and thank you very much for your support and for your great questions. You send me some great questions, and that's a very good one. And so basically, I got along great with those four guys, and never had a crossword.
Our next question is from Dwayne Light, Knoxville, Tennessee. Looking forward to the story continuing. Most of us Tennesseans that were fans back in the day of southeastern Knoxville don't really know what happened in the southeastern Gulf Coast territory when you left. We have watched a few tapes of the old TV shows, but there's nothing like listening to the story from the stud. Looking forward to the future.
Wow. Well, Dwayne, that's very nice, man. I'm happy to hear you say that. I have my studcast has traditionally, starting at the beginning, it was my grandfather, and then it got to my father, and it slowly worked up to where I got to my own territory, and then I started to do the studcast every week, just like I had wrestling every week. And then I got the two territories. I had Tennessee going, and I had Gulf Coast going, and now I've reached the point in 1979 where I sold Knoxville Wrestling, basically the Tennessee territory, to Jim Barnett out of Georgia, and I'm back down to just basically in this last studcast that I just did, number 325, talking basically about Gulf Coast, mostly just about Gulf Coast. But And I know that what you're talking about there, I have a streaming channel and places that you can go and find some Gulf Coast wrestling shows. And when you do that, you realize, what I did when we bought that territory is I made a decision that I didn't want to let the people down south, even know that there was a southeastern up north in Tennessee, and vice versa. Tennessee people had no idea that there was a territory called Southeastern that was down in Pensacola and along the Gulf Coast of Alabama and then an area, the Panhandle of Florida. And so it was just my plan was if I could have kept both the territories and I hadn't had the Knoxville War, in which that basically hurt Knoxville. It killed its business there for a long, long time. But my plan was to eventually turn the territories into wars and introduce the people in the North to what was going on in the South, and then say the South would challenge the North. And then I could have had these monster shows in which I had the Southeastern Tennessee against Southeastern Gulf Coast and the wrestlers against each other. Rather than wrestling against each other every night, they wrestle against the other territories' top wrestlers. I think the plan would have been marvelous. I think I could have it would have been unique for wrestling. But the wrestling war happened in Knoxville, and it didn't turn out to be that way. I really appreciate you saying I tell the story as good as the TV. And I do. I have to tell people that don't realize that I do so much research on each one of these studcasts before I actually do the studcast, and not only to see what the card was, but to see what information I can compile. I have the formats from the TV shows so that I can piece back together as best as possible how each card was booked, why it was booked that way, what the angles were on it, so I'm hoping that Tennesseans that are out there and watching this, I hope you're going to realize, wow, I mean, we did some unbelievable stuff in Knoxville. We didn't go down there and just do the exact same things in the Gulf Coast. We went down to the Gulf Coast and did some unbelievable things there. And a great example of that is the recent thing that we just did on one of our the little deals that we do every week to give you an idea of what was on these shows and everything, So, and we did the one in which Bob Armstrong turned heel as a referee in a match against me against Ric Flair for the World Championship. I mean, an unbelievable angle. I mean, never been done that way. I don't believe, probably maybe anywhere in the sport. So there's going to be a tremendous amount of stuff that happens in the Southeast that I think fans out of Tennessee are going to wow. They're going to be just as blown away by it as those Gulf Coast fans were blown away by it. So thank you very much, Dwayne. I appreciate it. A great guy. And been Budweiser. I've always been a huge wrestling fan, and I get your sentiment here, and I get your kind of what you're saying to me here, that Tennessee fans are hopefully going to follow us in the Gulf Coast, because they're going to see the same people, a lot of the same guys, but they're going to see them do a lot of different things than what they did when they were in Tennessee. And a great question, Dwayne, and I appreciate it very much.
Our next question is from Jason Gwynn, Nashville, Tennessee. Most territories use smaller managers. You use larger managers than most, Big Bad John, Ron Wright, and yourself, etc. What were your ideas and thoughts on hiring managers?
That's a great question, Jason. Good question. Out of Nashville. Nashville's got a lot going on this week. As a matter of fact, they got a big thing over there going on this week in Nashville. And well, my idea about managers was probably a lot different than what most guys' concept was for having a manager, and you're right about that. I never really thought much about it, but Big Bad John was a hell of a lot bigger than Ronnie Garvin that he managed, and Ron Wright was a lot bigger than some of the guys that he managed, and he managed all kinds of wrestlers for me over the 3 territories that I had that he worked in, and he not only wrestled, but he managed in most of those territories as well. And I, with the stud stable, and then we just answered a question earlier about, some stuff going on in the Gulf Coast. I'm going to do one of my favorite things I ever did, man. I'm going to have my own stable down there, man. And I'm going to be one of the biggest guys in the stable, so, and you're right. Most promoters didn't want to have a big manager. They wanted to have a big wrestler and a tiny manager, and that was the concept that I think managers managing were built upon. They were little weaselly small guys that had to sneak around and do something dirty and, get away with it, and then push the big wrestler out in front of them when somebody came to get him. That being the concept. But to me, you ask about how I looked at hiring managers. To me, I don't care what size he is. A manager's greatest skill, his most important asset to your company, was his talk. Could he talk? Could he rap? Could he get it done? Could he make the case for that big son of a gun that's standing behind him when he's doing his deal? So, to me, it was how good you talked is what was really important as a manager. And I had some smaller managers over time. But, and as you kind of brought out there, Big Bad John did Ronnie Garvin. Ron Wright, like I said, did a lot of guys. Most of them probably smaller than he was. But to me, I think the most important thing about your manager was how good was he on the mic. And if he was good on the mic, I don't care if he was 5 feet tall or 8 feet tall, as long as he could talk.
Our next question is from Russell Bell. Love your studcast. Back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, good heels could make fans go crazy, jumping in the ring or waiting on the heels in the parking lot. Did you let your wrestlers hit them? I heard that baby faces would help the heels fight off the fans to avoid the heels getting hurt.
Russell Bell, I think that was the name, Russell, and gosh, that name rings a bell, Russell, and it does. I think he lives over there, really close to where my grandfather had his dairy, in Yorkville, Tennessee, on the western side of the state of Tennessee. And I have spoken to Mr. Bell on occasion, and a great guy, very, very great guy. And I love that question. It's a really, really good question. I mean, you're right. I mean, there was a time in wrestling, believe it or not, for those that had never seen it or, into today's wrestling, when heels had heat, and when fans went after them. It wasn't uncommon for that to happen, and happened to me. I got cut and hit in the head with chairs, and wrestlers they all had little scars. Ron Wright, that we talked about earlier, had a scar that went from the back of his neck all the way to his butt with one knife blade. Cut him all the way down his spine. Wow, scar. So. Yeah, they were bad situations back in those days, Russell, and there's no doubt about it. My grandfather's day and my father, after my granddad, guys, you had to be careful as a wrestler. You had to really be paying attention, or you're going to get it someday. But you said, if did I let the wrestlers hit them if some guy got after him, if a mark got after him and they chased him out into the parking lot or they waited on him outside? Did I let him hit him? And answer is, to be quite honest with you, absolutely. Mark had to realize, man, that I might be taking a chance here. I got a great story. This brought a great story to mind about Mark waiting on somebody in the parking lot. This will go back into the 1950s when Mario Galento and my dad were wrestling in the Mobile territory. And they had an outside arena in Pensacola, Florida. And they had a fence put around the entire complex, so people had to buy a ticket to get in. But then they had a back gate where the wrestlers would park their cars back there. And the fans would sometimes get around that back part of the deal and park their cars too. And my dad told me a story about Mario Galento one time in a Mark, like you're talking about, Russell, waiting on him in the parking lot. And so Dad wrestled Galento, and he said that he was about to get ready to leave the dressing room. They had two separate dressing rooms. And he said Galento came out of his dressing room, and he said there was a guy, the gate to get down to your car, you had to go down about 40 yards to the gate and then come around and get into your car. And the guy's on the far side of the fence over there by his car. Got his car right there, and they said everybody else must pretty much gone. So he said Galento came out of there, and he said the guys hollered at him, and he said he had a knife in one hand and a tire tool in the other. And he said, Galento, he says, come on over here, come on around here, 'cause I'm going to cut you up, and I'm going to crush your skull with this tire tool. And I asked my dad, and he told me the story. I said, well, what did he do? And he said he dropped his bag right there, and he said, wait right there. And he said he took off running down to the fence where the gate was, right? And Dad said that the guy watched him run down to the gate, and as soon as he came around the gate, the guy went, oh, God. And Joe jumped in his car and threw his knife in there at the time and peeled out of the parking lot. I mean, so that was an example. If Galento had got a hold of him, he would have, no telling what he'd have done to that poor son of a gun. But, so Russell, yeah, I let my heels, know that, hey, if you have a problem, you can take care of it yourself, provided that you do it you don't go looking for it. Somebody comes looking for it, and especially if they put their hands on you and they do something bad to you, wow, I mean, go for it, get it done. So, and great question though, Russell. That wrestling was different. The 50s, the 60s, the 70s, even in the 80s. People still was into it, and they believed, and we made them believe. And nowadays, now it's hard to believe because you don't see nothing but flipping and flying, and you don't see anything bad enough to make you get angry. So different deal. But thank you very much, Russell. That's a great question.
Our next question is from Johnny Morgan. Do you think Vince McMahon Jr. could have kept the territories intact as well as had the national expansion?
Wow, what a great question there, man. Gee, I got to give that a little bit of thought. I mean, McMahon, I don't think McMahon wanted the territories to survive in any form or fashion. In order to do what he wanted to do, to take over wrestling entirely, to be the one-man show. He had the national network that gave him the national expansion deal. He had that because nobody else in the country had a national television show. So, he was in a position where he was going to get control eventually, And so, but gosh, and I have to go back to my opportunity in about 1985, 86, of having NBC, going to New York and turning down an opportunity to have that national TV. If I had done what Vince did and had the national TV, I wouldn't have tried to kill the territories. I would have done what you're asking here. It would have been possible to keep the territories and have a national TV? Of course it would have been, if you weren't greedy enough to want to own it all. And in fact, whoever had that national TV, if he was a good guy and he was a member of the NWA and friends with all the guys that own territories, he'd want to get them included. If I had gotten that show, what I would have done with it is I would have gone to the NWA meeting and I would have said, guys, I want to have your best talent work on the national TV show. I wouldn't even call it my TV show. It could have been the NWA. Imagine that if it had been, instead of a WWE, that have the NWA national television show. And every week when you did a show, you had a guy from the Houston territory, and you had a guy from Portland, and you had a guy from Florida, and you had a guy from the Carolinas, and they got these big wins. And then you worked angles. You started working angles between all of these tremendous wrestlers, man, that were available and already working for different territories. And you could have just created these monster shows in which, once you got these guys on your TV, after a year of that and all these different big huge stars, just top guys, bringing in top guys in everybody's territory, then you start putting together these mega shows, man. It could have been 5 WrestleManias a year instead of 1 WrestleMania a year. And it could have been in 5 different major cities in America. And it could have been those 5 events with 60 of the very greatest wrestlers in the world, rather than just the guys that Vince wanted to show and just the guys that Vince wanted to use. Wow. The way to have Vince handled it was just absolutely horrible. It was the worst way it could have been handled. And it was because he didn't want anybody. So obviously Vince wanted, the first job he had was to kill the territories. And then he already had the TV. He had control of all of it. And he even went about killing the territories in the worst possible way by using the guys that those territories had created, made stars out of. He stole them and put them on his TV shows. And then he took those same guys back into those territories and ran cards against them. He's a rotten, I hate to say it, but he's a rotten human being, and he killed wrestling. One of the great things about it, I didn't even think about this part of it, but that wrestling wouldn't have been where it is now because you wouldn't have had to change the sport. You wouldn't have had to flip and fly. You wouldn't have had to change your style of wrestling. And what was going on in the 1980s, wrestling was so hot all around the world, man. They had the greatest wrestlers. It was the greatest sport going. And when he got a hold of it, he killed it. Instead of training like we'd always train guys and made shooters out of them first and taught them how to be real wrestlers and to appreciate wrestling, he did just the opposite. He wanted it to be a big show and a bunch of, have a big pot, smudge pots and the fireworks and, wrestling was the fireworks. The the greatest wrestling ever was taking place in the 1980s, and he came in and just demolished it. And look where it is now. That's what I say. Look where it is now. And, well, great question. Sorry you got me off on it, but I got real deep feelings about what McMahon did to wrestling, and I can't help it.
Our next question is from Darnell Middleton, Harlan, Kentucky. Ron, where is the original ring from Southeastern Wrestling?
Wow. Darnell, Harlan, Kentucky. I love that city, son, man. Wow. I've seen some crazy stuff happen in that town. I have seen a town that has a sign when you enter it, it says population 3,000, and I've had more than 3,000 in that gymnasium many Saturday nights in Harlan, Kentucky, one of the greatest wrestling cities in America. And where is the original Southeastern ring? Well, this is going to take a few minutes here, and maybe this will be a little bit educational for people that don't understand how wrestling companies were sold and how they were built and how they worked, and especially when it came to rings. And rings are a very interesting subject. One of these days I'm going to do a studcast just on rings. But when you bought a territory, the rings always came with it. Okay, and so let's just take Knoxville as an example. In 1974, I bought Knoxville from John Kazana, and John Kazana didn't run a whole lot of towns because he had a TV that didn't go out very far, so he only had matches on Friday night in Knoxville. And on Saturday night, he would have matches in a city that was pretty close to Knoxville, like Morristown or something within about 40 miles, because that's about as far as his TV signal got out. So he didn't have a need for a lot of rings, okay? So he only had a ring that he used in his building for Knoxville, which was in Chilhowie Park, and he used it outside in the amphitheater when it was summertime. I think it was probably a 16-foot ring, which, that was customary size, 16-foot square back in those days. And he had a ring that he used on TV. And he probably used the TV ring to run matches in Morristown. He would haul it up there on a truck or whatever. So the original ring, there were only 2 rings when I got there. And I didn't like the ring. I didn't like the either one of the rings, actually. And so I got my dad to build me a wrestling ring, and my dad he built the very best wrestling rings, starting in the 80s. And when you go towns and wrestle in Memphis as an example, or you go to these big cities in the country, you knew it was a Buddy Fuller ring. The wrestlers would come back after they went out and they'd never been in that town before, and they would show, who built that ring? And and it was a privilege and an honor to have a Buddy Fuller ring. And so I had my dad build me a 20-foot, which it doesn't sound like a big difference between 16 feet and 20-foot ring, but there's an amazing difference. So I had him build me a 20-foot ring for Knoxville, because I was going to be in the Coliseum some too. So, and I used that ring for the Chilhowie Park and the Knoxville shows. But then I was running more towns. I had Johnson City, Tennessee, and I had to have a ring up there. So Dad built me a 16-footer for Johnson City, Tennessee. And then he built a television ring for me, which had short posts because you had the lights over your ring in the studio, and they weren't that high up, and you couldn't have a real high ring. You had to have a low ring that was close to the floor so that guys didn't flip guys up into the lights during the matches, backdrop guys into the lights. That ain't too cool a deal. You knock down a light, man, on a TV show, it's a pretty bad place to be, especially you don't want to be under it when it lands. I can tell you that. So So only had about 3 rings in that, and I had a ring built that he put in the truck for me, a small 16-foot ring. So I had 4 rings in that Knoxville territory. So the original ring, when I bought Southeastern, got trashed, to be honest with you, because I didn't like it, and I had my dad build me a bona fide humdinger of a ring. So when I went to Gulf Coast, it was a different situation. Now you got major cities there, and they run every week, and you don't want to haul a ring around everywhere. So he built me a ring, and he had built such great rings in the 50s when he was there, and about then in 78, 20 years later, a lot of the rings were his rings. They were 20 years old, and they were still in phenomenal shape. So I had a Pensacola ring, I had a ring in Mobile, I had a separate ring in Montgomery, I had a separate ring in Dothan, I had a television ring, and then I had a small ring that went on the smaller cities where I ran. So in that case, in that territory, I had 6 rings. And a lot of territories were like that. Carolina territory, Mid-Atlantic, for instance, was in a lot of big cities. And if you went there every week, you didn't want to haul a ring in and out, you left the ring. And the buildings just stored it for you, and they set it up for you. So that's kind of a little history lesson there, I guess, Darnell. The original Knoxville ring got trashed, and got thrown away. And it got replaced for a 16-foot ring, man, that had old boards on it, made out of wood, got replaced by a shiny son of a gun, a steel-plated, big 4x4 frames that went across the bottom, the pounding of them, and they made the noise. I mean, and it didn't kill you when you took a bump. It sounded like the building came down, and it was there. Like I said, there's maybe a whole entire studcast someday, and how the heck rings were built, and what made them good, and what made them horrible, and that's my answer, my man. Original Southeastern ring, it was in a trash dump somewhere.
Our next question is from Tony Gahan, Annapolis, Maryland. When the local TV station found out you were selling or had already sold Southeastern, did they try to convince you to change your mind?
Tony, that's a really good question. I got to say, though, when I went to Knoxville, the first TV station I was on was one up on top of the mountain there in Knoxville, and it had a very weak signal, and they had not a big audience. The wrestling show was not the greatest wrestling show, that's for sure. And Big Jim Hess had the warp your head off, whole go, all this stuff going on, and there was when I saw it, I said, there's no way I can make this territory big with this. So I went to Channel 10 about 6 months in, and I got on WBIR, which was a CBS affiliate in Knoxville. So the station, instead of going out 40 miles, it went out 140 miles in all directions. It was a hoss. And overnight, Knoxville went from one town and a Morristown on Saturday to 6 nights a week, and 150 miles away. You could go and people would know your wrestlers and everything. It was that far away. So, and wow, the great thing about it was it wasn't luck. And I want to say, well, we were lucky, but Les and I had spent years traveling the roads in Florida as young guys and talking about television shows. And if you ever got a territory, well, what kind of TV would you do? And so when we got a hold of Channel 10, I remember Les was walking on Cloud 9. He goes, Ron, this is it. This is the monster. He goes, we can do all of everything we wanted to do. And so we went in there and we came up with personality profile, and we came up with a tremendous set that had 4 sides to it, and you could turn, and while you're talking, the set would change backgrounds. I mean, we had the best wrestling show, and it won awards all across the country. The best wrestling show in America was Southeastern. We were top notch, and when we left that small station, they were getting $50 for television, for a commercial, $50 for a commercial. And so when we went to the big station, they didn't really know what to charge. And, wrestling had not been wrestling was going to explode. That's what it was all about. This station was going to explode the business. And so they started out at $75 for a spot. And first year there, that 75 went from 75 to 150. It doubled the price of the spot. And they had 8 of those in each show. So they, boom, it went from, like $500 to way over $1,000. The second year there, it went to 200. The third year there, it went to $300 a spot in wrestling. There was no show on that television station from sign on to prime time that got $300 for a spot. And not only was every spot sold out in Southeastern wrestling, but there was a waiting list that for people that said, if you ever get an opening, I want that show, I want to be in wrestling, I want wrestling. And the reason was because it was an 80 share. 8 out of 10 homes was watching it when TV was on Saturday afternoons. So it became a monster product. And I had such a great relationship with that television station, and they just loved wrestling. It just astounded them, the numbers. They every time it was rating period and the books came in from Armatron and Nielsen, they had a meeting just for me and with the entire the sales departments and all the departments. It was a celebration in the big conference room of the wrestling numbers. Look at these numbers. I've never seen an 80 share. I've never seen an 80 share. They were all going crazy. And that's a great question. They never did come to me because I sold out, and they really didn't know. But they didn't realize. Probably they thought, well, it was still Southeastern. We didn't change the name. We didn't change anything except the wrestlers changed and the promoters changed and the angles and the quality of the show changed. And eventually those numbers went from an 80 share back down to a 40 or a 50 share. 2 years after I was gone, it was from an 80 down to a 50 share. And obviously, so did those commercials that they were selling. Go from 300 down to 150 probably. And so, I'm sure they would have come to me if they had realized, that, wow, him leaving is going to really change everything here with this wrestling program. But that's kind of basically what happened there. And, it made things difficult. It wasn't long until they actually got rid of the show. They canned the show probably in 1983. There was no wrestling on television there anymore at all. It got to be that bad. Wrestling got to be that bad in Knoxville. A sad, sad situation. 2 years after that, though, we're going to be making Continental TV. Biggest thing ever, man. 7,000 seats. It ain't 200 people in a studio audience. It's 7,000 people in a big building. And great talent and television. They found out about us. Not the same TV, but Channel 6. A different network. Still a national network. found out about us, and they called me up and they said, would you like to bring wrestling back to Knoxville? And by gosh, we threw that show in there, and it went right back to an 80 share, man. I mean, it was like overnight. Wow, it was tremendous for them, and it was tremendous for us. We sold out every Coliseum show with Continental. Every time we went there, the building was packed. So, little history for you there, man. And but a great question.
Our next question comes from Ronaldo Gutierrez, San Juan, Puerto Rico. Watched you in the early 70s in the Hiram Bithram Baseball Stadium and the Roberto Clemente Coliseum. Which do you think was more dangerous for the wrestlers?
Well, I can tell you're out of Puerto Rico, man. If you're asking the question about what's dangerous to wrestlers, I mean, wow, that's a city, man. If you were a heel, you really didn't want to go to that one. When you saw that on your weekly schedule, you were like, oh my, no, I don't really want to go. And you got two buildings there. I mean, evidently you did see me there because when I first started wrestling there in about 1971, 71, we were going every other Saturday night to San Juan, Puerto Rico. And then we would fly out of there on Sunday and go into the Bahamas and wrestle in the Bahamas on Sundays and come back into the States. Huron Beathorn was the name of that baseball stadium. It was a death trap to heels. For heels, it was an absolute death trap. It had a baseball. It's a baseball field, so they had a screen that went down and protected the fans. It went obviously right behind the plate, and then for a certain distance down to the dugout was all sealed off, and then over the dugout they had no screen. But then beyond the dugout, they had a little screen down the left field and the right field line to protect you from the baseball. But in the wrestling business, it was to protect the wrestlers from things being thrown at them, right? You know, I mean, so and there was this little tiny section over top of both the dugouts that had no screen. Okay, so that's where they all piled up. When the heel came out of the heel's dressing room, he came out of that dugout. It was about, I'd say about maybe 100 feet to the ring from there. Ring set on home plate, basically. Nobody out on the field sitting. And so the heel would come to the top of the dugout, where the cement dugout stood over top of him. And he would get his feet slide. You see him over there, and he'd get his feet up onto the top step. And then he would charge, he would run as fast as he could from there to the ring. And everything came up, boards and bottles, and it was rocks. I mean, it was like, oh, we'd stand, you'd watch the baby faces, we'd watch over there and go, oh, wow, are they going to get him? They're going to get him, they're going to get him. And then it was the same thing when the match was over. Now you had to get back there. How are you going to get back there again, right? So that Huron Beathorn was a bad place, right? We had a big riot there one time with Dale Lewis, and wow, I could probably spend 10 minutes talking about that one riot, but it was dangerous, tremendously dangerous. So right before we closed down, Florida quit running there in about 1972, and they had just built the Roberto Clemente Coliseum. And it was beautiful. Wow, it was a beautiful facility. I mean, I remember the first time I ever worked in it, I went out and looked at it. I was like, gosh, this is one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. But it was a bigger death trap than Huron. I mean, the fans were right on top of you in that thing, man. And the police worked good. The police didn't care. They jump on you, the cops would run the other way. They'd rather come and help get the guys off of you or whatever it was. So, wow, what a great question, man. You had to be there to see that situation, Ronaldo, to understand your question here. But I really don't know. I think actually the Clemente Coliseum was even more dangerous than Huron Beathorn. Because people here can't really imagine wrestling in other countries. It was a real experience. It wasn't like America. And when you went down to Puerto Rico, those fans were crazy and they wanted to kill you. They wanted to kill the heels. And when you went to the Bahamas, they threw rocks. They threw rocks over the walls, and they threw people over the walls into the arena. I mean, you never knew what was going to be next in some of those places when you went out of the country to wrestle. And a great question, Ronaldo. I really appreciate you asking that.
Our next question is from Tim Maxwell. When you bought Birmingham from Nick Goulas, why didn't you also buy Chattanooga?
That's a very good question, Tim. Really, really good question. And earlier we had some conversation, and one of the questions about Knoxville people maybe not knowing what happened down there on the Gulf Coast. And one of the main things that happened on the Gulf Coast and made that territory so prolific is we were able to buy Birmingham from Nick Goulas in Tennessee. And when we bought Birmingham, it was the biggest city in Alabama. It was the biggest city in the territory. And it had been a great wrestling town, but Nick Goulas had run it in the ground. He had used his son, George Goulas, as the champion, who wasn't a wrestler. He should have never been a wrestler, much less the champion. And so we had to build it back. But at the same time, he had Birmingham, he had Nashville, he had Birmingham, and he had Chattanooga. Those were his three main cities. They were all dead. He had killed all of them with his son. But we always wanted to have, one of the reasons that Knoxville was so successful was that the trips were very short for the wrestlers. And guys wanted to come and wrestle in a territory in which they didn't have to be making 500-mile trips every day. And the longest trip in the Knoxville territory was 120 miles. So, that was unheard of back in those days. So we got great wrestlers because they could be home by midnight every night. And they didn't have to stay over. In a lot of territories, big territories, you had to stay over, get a hotel room. You were gone for 2 days, that type of thing. And so great stars were willing, they wanted to wrestle in Knoxville and they wanted to be in that territory because of that. Now we went to Gulf Coast, it was a similar situation. You had Mobile, Pensacola is only 50 miles from Mobile, Dothan is only 100 over there, 125, 100 miles north of Montgomery, to only 200 to about a little around 200 to Birmingham, okay? Well, Birmingham wasn't part of the territory, but right away I saw what was happening, that Nick Goulas is going to die. He's going to want to either walk away from Nashville, Birmingham, and Chattanooga, or he's going to want to sell them. And so I think you named Tim, Birmingham fit into our territory, fit into what we had and what we wanted to do. Chattanooga was too far. It was another 200 miles away from Birmingham. And that meant that from Pensacola, where we lived, to Birmingham was 250. But when you got to 400 miles one way and 400 miles back, now you don't have a small territory anymore. So I guess, that's the reason I had very little interest in Chattanooga, because it was going to change it was going to change my territory. It was going to change the territory from being a short jump, good money territory to these long trips in which you had to pay wrestlers even better to make the long trips. So that's, I guess, my best description of it. And we went there to Birmingham. We were there. We're right now in 1979 in my studcast. We're going to run in 1980. Before the end of 1980, we're going to be wrestling in Birmingham. And it is going to explode the Southeastern Territory. It will make it huge overnight, being in that big city up there in Birmingham. And I think if we had gone on to Chattanooga and bought Chattanooga, I think it would have been detrimental rather than a big, huge factor of making Southeastern what it was.
Our next question is from Nicholas Steinbach, overseas. Who was tougher, Dick Slater or Billy Robinson?
Wow. I love that question, I tell you that, Nicholas. And I assume that you're in the service, my man, and hats off to you, man. Thank you for your service overseas. I don't know what you're in exactly, but this day and time, got a great deal of appreciation, man, for you guys and what y'all do, and thank you for what you do for being into what you are, and we really appreciate it. All right, well, you got two different guys there. I mean, you couldn't get much further separated in the difference between Dick Slater and Billy Robinson. And Dick Slater, I know great. I mean, Dick I grew up with. He wrestled for me. He booked for me. He's a personal friend. Wow. So throughout the whole war, he was a staunch supporter, man, no doubt about that. Billy Robinson, I know very little about, but I know that Billy was in the Florida territory quite a bit, and I know that Billy Robinson was a great shooter. He was from England, and wow. I heard stories about he's one of those snake pit guys. That really could do it. And, so I would have loved to have met him. I would have loved to have worked out with him. I mean, I loved learning stuff. And this guy had a reputation for really knowing how to shoot, man. Dick Slater, he had a reputation too, but his reputation didn't have really much to do with wrestling at all, man. Dick Slater should have been a boxer. Dick Slater had the best right hand I ever saw on a human being, man. I mean, and I saw him hit a few guys with it, and I never saw him have to hit a guy twice. I mean, he turned the lights out, and bow, it was over, bang. It was just like that, down face first, and so. I don't know how you put those two guys together. I'm not sure. I got to just follow up just a little bit on the Dick Slater deal. Dick had an modus operandi, I guess that you call it, far beyond just knocking them out. He had that deal he loved to do, and I saw him do it to at least 3 guys, and I've had other guys tell me they saw him do it to other people, and he got into it, and he would knock them out, and then he would drag them into the bathroom and flush their head in the commode. I never discussed that with Dick. What's the commode flushing all about? But that was quite a scene to see, man. I saw it happen to Bob Orton Jr. right in front of his daddy. I mean, Dick hit him, man. They had a little problem in the ring, wrestling each other, and I could see it. And they got back to the dressing room, and boys, something happened, and I think Orton took a swing at him, and oh boy, Dick hit him with that right hand, and oh man, they could hear it in downtown Orlando, man. I mean, it just wow. And down he went face first, and his daddy, Orton Sr., on the card, wrestling in 2 matches down the card, main event, sitting right there watching Dick pop him, man, and down he went on his face, and Dick, first thing Dick did is he turned and looked at his daddy, and he said, "You want some of it?" And his daddy just dropped his head, and that's when Dick grabbed him, Orton Jr., by the hair, and he drug him by the hair into the bathroom. I had to follow in there. I had to see what's he going to do to him. And he stuffed his head in the toilet and flushed the toilet. So I don't know who would have won the fight, to be honest with you. But I'll tell you this: if Slater got the first shot, Robinson's shooting wasn't going to do him no good.